three speakers that will participate in this panel. I will announce the speakers now in the order that they will go. First of all, we will have Ms. Danielle Marais. Her paper will be on how illegal fishing hinders sustainable development in South Africa. Second, we will have Ms. Nikita Hirolal talking about livelihood challenges and coping strategies of sub-Saharan African subsistence fishing communities. And then the third paper will be by Dr. Mbile Ngwema Isaac Shavely on challenges of combating illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing in Africa in the context of sustainable development goals. My name is Dr. Derika Lambrechts and I'm from Stellenbosch University. And I also work on aspects of environmental organized crime. And I called this panel in order to expose more, of course, African scholars dealing with environmental crime aspects, and I hope that we can have a very good discussion today. Because with three speakers in this panel, we will each have I will give each of the speakers 15 minutes in order to present their research combined by a PowerPoint. And I think let's keep question and answer sessions, questions for after all of the presentations. We should have more than enough time for any of that. In the meantime, if you have questions, I'll keep an eye on the chat. So you please post your questions in the chat. And I will make a note of that. But as I said, we will have questions afterwards. We will switch off our cameras after we've done the first introduction of each speaker, just to make sure that we have a comfortable discussion and conversation. Please also mute if it's not your turn to speak. Like I said, if you have any questions, please pose it in the chat. Okay, then I will immediately move on to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Danielle Marais. Danielle Marais is studying to obtain her master's degree in political science at Stellenbosch University. Her thesis is entitled Ocean Governance for Sustainable Development, the Case of Marine Protected Areas in South Africa. Danielle was a 2022 scholar with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Foundation and the South African Institute of International Affairs. Currently, she works as a country and political risk analyst with Signal Risk. Okay, Danielle, are you ready? Welcome and thank you for contributing to this panel.
Cool, thank you so much for inviting me. It is my first panel, so excuse any nerves, but I'm just going to, I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Okay, are you guys, are we seeing this?
Yes, Danielle, it's fine from my side.
Okay, cool. Okay, so good morning, everybody. So as Dr. Lambrechts mentioned, I am a master's student at Stellenbosch University, and I have been writing my thesis about South Africa's use of its marine protected areas to help reach the Sustainable Development Goals as part of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So my presentation is really going to give quite a general overview of ocean governance in South Africa. And I will start by giving an overview of sustainable development and the blue economy in South Africa. And from then I will discuss marine protected areas in South Africa. And lastly, I will discuss what my thesis has found regarding the SDGs in South Africa. And of course, I will focus greatly on people breaking regulations and illegal fishing and MPAs as well. So I just really wanted to base my thesis on the ocean, as we are truly dependent on healthy oceans for a healthy earth. And it provides a large portion of the world's population with sustenance and economic opportunities. But most importantly, the ocean supports life through the generation of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and the regulation of the Earth's temperatures. But these vital functions are hindered by various factors such as climate change and issues such as overfishing. So the need for ocean sustainability has become even more pertinent than before. And many coastal countries have started focusing on the opportunities that the ocean presents for economic growth. And while the ocean has been used for economic growth in the past, there has been little to no consideration for ocean sustainability. So to this end, the sustainable development of oceans has become quite an important topic in the international sphere, where we can strike a balance between the use of marine resources while ensuring that they remain sustainable for future generations. Okay, next slide. So the adoption of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in 2015, along with the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, has really brought attention to ocean sustainability. As you can see, there's SDG 14, Life Below Water, which brings attention to the protection of the ocean. But I think more importantly, ocean sustainability actually supports all of these other goals as well. The need for a sustainable ocean economy has become quite evident due to humanity's increasing reliance on the ocean for food, energy, transport, and services. And the economic intelligence analyst defines the blue economy as something that emerges when economic activity is in balance with the long-term capacity of ocean ecosystems to support this activity and remain resilient and healthy. Now, moving on to South Africa. South Africa's blue economy strategy is known as Operation Phakisa, unlocking the ocean economy. Oceans had previously been underexplored in their potential to provide socio-economic goods and services to drive growth. And the main focus areas of Operation Phakisa, which you can see here, is marine transport and manufacturing, offshore oil and gas exploration, aquaculture, marine protection services and ocean governance, small harbors development, and coastal and marine tourism. But perhaps one of the most important achievements of Operation Phakisa is that it led to the creation of 20 new MPAs in 2019, increasing the portion of protected ocean in South Africa to 5.4% from 0.4%. And these MPAs provide protection to 90% of habitat types in South Africa. Now, while Operation Phakisa does have a focus on sustainability, it is clearly an economic development program. And its focus on things like offshore oil and gas exploration are quite concerning from an environmental sustainability point of view, as these can seriously deteriorate marine habitats. But this is the main challenge when it comes to countries like South Africa, where you have to really find a balance between economic growth and environmental sustainability. When you have issues such as high poverty, high inequality, and high unemployment, there is a clear need for socioeconomic development. But at the same time, activities such as offshore oil and gas exploration can harm the natural environment. Another sector is the fishing sector, which is very important for South Africa's economy, but it can become quite exploitative when it is not done in a proper manner. So this brings us to the topic of marine protected areas in South Africa. So MPAs are defined as a clearly defined geographical space, recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. Many scientists consider MPAs to be the backbone of South Africa's marine conservation strategy. However, South African MPAs have a history of exclusion. The apartheid government from 1948 to 1994 started establishing MPAs in the 1960s, with the first one being the Tsitsikamma MPA in 1964. Now, from 1970 to the post-apartheid South Africa, marine protected areas were established in reaction to falling fishing stocks. However, the apartheid government created MPAs opportunistically in response to public pressure, instead of evaluating fully where and why MPAs were needed. And MPAs were established and governed in a very centralized manner using fortress conservation, which focused on keeping people, usually indigenous people, out of these coastal areas. And ultimately, MPAs followed the apartheid government's segregationist and racist ideals. Now, since the end of apartheid, the ANC South African government has focused on inclusivity and equality in all forms of governance. Accordingly, legislation for the management of protected areas focuses on cooperative environmental governance, participatory decision-making, and benefit sharing. However, when it comes to the implementation of these policies, we do not see these values coming through. And this leads, of course, to the breaking of regulations in MPAs. And there are various reasons why people may be prompted to fish illegally or informally in South Africa's MPAs. Now, I should also note that some MPAs are completely no-take zones, so you're not allowed to do any fishing, while others have designated areas for fishing or other economic activities. So past and present exclusionary manners of governing MPAs creates negative perceptions towards them. And many studies show that perceptions towards MPAs play a very important role in the effectiveness of MPAs. And negative perceptions from past experiences could mean that coastal communities do not value the MPAs, even if they are ecologically effective. While MPAs can have several socioeconomic benefits, such as ecotourism, employment opportunities, capacity building, The negative impacts tend to stick out more to surrounding communities, and these can include the weakening of local governance, rights and processes, the loss of tenure rights and access to resources, and the loss of livelihood. And these negative effects have resulted in many people questioning the legitimacy of MPAs, from their actual existence to the way in which they are regulated. Additionally, if stakeholders are not included in the process throughout engagement meetings or co-management committees, they may feel that their needs have not been considered in the governance of MPAs. And this could also contribute towards negative perceptions, as well as a lack of understanding as to why the MPA exists and the regulations surrounding the MPAs. So if community members are not informed or properly educated on the purpose of the MPA, there is a higher chance that these regulations will be broken. Additionally, these negative perceptions and past injustices can lead to the idea that MPAs are unjust. This leads to protest fishing against MPA regulations. Local communities often hold that they have historically had access to these areas for centuries before they were declared MPAs. Therefore, they do not deem it fair to be cut off from the sea, especially because many groups have extremely strong cultural and historical links to the sea. Other times, fishers may feel that they have to continue fishing even in dangerous conditions, as it is their only means of survival. Therefore, illegal fishing arises because of loss of livelihood and loss of access to resources. Thus, the more people see MPAs as illegitimate, the more likely they are to break regulations, which counters the objectives of MPAs. Of course, I should note that there are many cases of illegal fishing which are linked to other more serious forms of criminality. For example, the abalone and rock lobster poaching in South Africa has links to international criminal syndicates which target poorer communities in South Africa to provide them with abalone or rock lobster in return for money or other illegal substances, such as drugs. These syndicates have become increasingly prevalent in South Africa since the 1990s, but unfortunately my research did not focus much on these syndicates, but you'll see on my last slide, I will have some studies up that you can read if you're interested in that. Okay, so overall, my study has found that South Africa does not govern its MPAs in an effective manner that is conducive to achieving the SDGs overall. Of course, I should note that many people agree that South Africa has quite a strong science and policy framework behind MPAs. But many people that I interviewed for my thesis agreed that there's too much of a scientific focus and not enough on the sharing of Indigenous and cultural values and knowledge when looking to implement an MPA. And now I'm not at all diminishing the importance of scientific research, as it really is like one of the backbones of MPAs. But perhaps if we integrate more of the Indigenous knowledge, it will encourage compliance with regulations and encourage co-management rather than hostility towards MPAs. Additionally, South Africa does not implement its policies and laws effectively due to many issues such as a lack of capacity, lack of funding, high corruption levels, and poor collaboration between government departments. My study also found that while South Africa has made some efforts towards ensuring equity from MPAs, there are still many obstacles preventing this, and these include a lack of representation of community stakeholders in stakeholder engagements, inefficient benefit sharing mechanisms in many MPAs, and an overall insufficient education and awareness surrounding MPAs. Thus, despite some efforts to address past injustices, MPAs are still largely exclusive against poorer communities as they are governed in a top-down manner. And ultimately, these are some of the factors that lead the most to illegal fishing. Additionally, many South African MPAs are not monitored over a long-term basis to ensure that they reach their objectives and that they are adaptable to changing ocean conditions. Additionally, prevailing poor socioeconomic standards in South Africa for coastal Indigenous populations will continue to affect MPA objectives negatively over the long term, which will go against the SDGs. Indeed, poverty and inequality are catalysts for crime. Ultimately, when you're trying to feed yourself and your family, and your food comes predominantly from the ocean, you won't necessarily consider the sustainability of that species for future generations. Yep, thank you. And these are some articles that I found extremely helpful for my thesis, and maybe if you're interested, you would like to read these too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. In good time. Perfect. Thank you so much. I did not note any questions in the chat yet, but I will keep an eye on that. Let me just quickly see. Start my video. Okay, and I think then we can immediately move on to our second speaker. As I've introduced her earlier, second speaker will be Nikita. The title that I have here in front of me that I read out to you earlier, there's a slight change between the one that she's got on the PowerPoint, still speaking about the same topic, but just a little bit of a more focused one in the one that Nikita will present you with. So Ms. Nikita Hiralal is a doctoral candidate in development studies at University of Cambridge. Her research aims to interrogate the relationship between food security and conflict. She is the recipient of the Cambridge Africa Scholarship, awarded to outstanding applicants from sub-Saharan Africa to pursue full-time postgraduate degrees in any subject available at the University of Cambridge. Prior to pursuing her PhD, she was a program officer at the Special Projects Department at the African Center for the Constructive Resolution of Disputes, ACCORD, where she worked in conflict management and mitigation with a focus on urban and African conflict. She's a former Marty, or Stellenbosch University alumni, who graduated her master's cum laude in international studies from Stellenbosch University, with a thesis focused on internet governance and cybersecurity. During this time, she was adopted as a scholarship student by the Mitsubishi UFJ Scholarship Foundation to enroll in Sophia University's graduate program in global studies for a semester in Tokyo, Japan. Okay, so Nikita, thank you very much, first of all, for joining us, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Derica. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As shared by Derica, my name is Nikita, and I am a PhD student at the University of Cambridge's Center for Development Studies. So jumping straight in, I think if we can start sharing the slides. So I'm just going to go for it. Essentially, what I've done here in the first initial slides is I've identified key features of the illicit blue economy in South Africa. What I will be doing essentially in terms of structure is beginning by elaborating on the South African experience and providing some state-specific examples of blue crime within a country context. I will then shift to a summation of my own research and conclude by sharing thoughts for how a focus on human rights could be used in formulating strategies and responses to blue crime on the African continent. So next slide, please. And the one after. Excellent, thank you. Whizzing through, here I've identified several key features and evidence of the illicit blue economy in South Africa as described in existing literature. First, we have IUU. South Africa was ranked 13th as the worst country globally for illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, according to the 2021 edition of the IUU Fishing Index. Hake in particular is subject to high levels of illegal fishing and is also South Africa's largest export fishery. As mentioned by Danielle, poaching and abalone theft. The illegal harvesting of abalone is a prominent issue in South Africa, and it is estimated that the country loses about $60 million a year due to abalone poaching alone. It is driven by a high market demand, particularly in Asian countries where it is considered a delicacy, which leads to a third feature of organized crime networks in the illicit blue economy. Criminal syndicates are heavily involved in the abalone trade and often using divers to extract the shellfish from coastal waters. These networks are also apparent in the fourth feature, which is drug trafficking, with South Africa standing out as a major destination for much of the heroin that enters the region, both as an end destination for local sale and consumption and for onward shipping. And finally, inadequate regulatory and enforcement mechanisms, wherein weak governance, corruption, and inadequate enforcement mechanisms have enabled the growth of the illicit economy. So just to flag, with the abalone, we have quite an expert in our midst with Derica, loads of questions pointed to her for that. Moving on then to the next slide. Thank you. So now I'll be moving on to an overview of my research and findings specifically. And the research I have conducted aims to understand conflict or insecurity as a function of sustainable livelihood deprivations and external pressures imposed on coastal fishing communities in sub-Saharan Africa. It sought to interrogate the challenges faced by literalists and determine what coping mechanisms they adopt when these livelihoods come under threat, locating these responses in broader regional, historical, or institutional conditions and security contexts. In terms of methods for data collection, a methodological pluralist stance was adopted in the research design using both quantitative and qualitative methodologies. During my field work, I looked at various sites along the South African East Coast in the province of KwaZulu-Natal and made use of several different data collection methods including semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, field observations, and a structured questionnaire surveying the socioeconomic context of fishers around the Durban Harbour and piers. So there's a bit, you can see the KwaZulu-Natal coastline is quite expansive. Yeah, and with that, there are 3 particular findings coming out from my preliminary analysis that I would like to highlight today. That is, if we can shift to the next slide. Great. The failings of fishery policy implementation in South Africa, the forced criminalization of livelihoods, and issues around how we securitize space relating to the blue economy. So before that, some background for context. Small scale and subsistence fishers in South Africa currently fall under the remit of the Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment, and their activities are broadly managed under the framework of the small scale fisheries policy. The subsistence descriptor was first recognized in South Africa in 1998, prior to which subsistence communities were perceived as catching illegally or poaching. The term has since once again been abolished in legislation, but the SSF policy makes allowances for subsistence fishers to be recognized. Exact figures aren't known, but a 2002 survey conducted by a government-appointed task group identified 147 fishing communities in the country, estimating that there were about 28,338 subsistence fishers total. In South Africa, fisheries have historically been dominated by the commercial marine sector, with small-scale fisheries currently contributing less than 1% to South Africa's GDP. Nonetheless, they play an incredibly important role in the provision of food and employment. Cool. So with that, I'm going to move into the first point I have on the slide. In identifying challenges faced by fishing communities, the first finding points to failures in SSF policy implementation. So in fact, there's an almost blatant disconnect between the policy, which on paper can be lauded as being quite progressive, and the on-the-ground practices and attitudes towards small-scale and subsistence fisherfolk. Some specific examples encountered in my research include a resumption of top-down approaches wherein fishing communities were excluded from consultation processes, such as those required for the ongoing Marine Spatial Development Plan under Operation Pakisa, as Danielle said already. Furthermore, there has been limited to no uptake of co-management systems for local marine sources as intended by the policy. Other major failings are apparent in the rollout and processes around verifying SFF status. Government officials were not readily accessible and the process was not transparent. So effectively, community members had to wait for local visits, which were poorly advertised, did not reoccur, and served to later exclude a number of people who had missed the boat in registering. Conditions that needed to be met to have SSF status conferred were also exclusionary. So individuals could not apply, and status and licenses could only be granted as a group. This is a particular challenge for subsistence fishers in and around the Durban Harbour and piers who commute to fishing sites in an urban setting and, for the most part, fish alone. Their inability to meet these conditions and the abolition of the subsistence status means that has meant that they are unable to access any rights or recognition under the SFF policy, with most of them having to adapt by using recreational licenses to access marine resources, so signaling further inadequacies of existing legal mechanisms in operationalizing the policy. Cool. Can we, no, sorry, back with just a couple more to go with that. Cool. So, of livelihoods. So that kind of leads me nicely to the next finding I'd like to raise, which is that failures in policy implementation and governance have resulted in the forced criminalization of fisherfolk livelihoods. Small-scale and subsistence fishers in KZN derive livelihoods from their activities in the form of cash income from selling catch, low-pay labor, food sovereignty, and state grants. Although the sector doesn't generate high economic returns, it serves a critical function in poverty alleviation, helping poor and marginalized households sustain a living. Whereas initially my study set out to understand how fisherfolk cope with stresses and challenges to their livelihoods, what quickly became apparent is that in the case of the subsistence community, fishing is itself the coping strategy, particularly in the South African socio-economic context where unemployment is high and social security is minimal. Fishing serves as a means to eke out an existence through small cash sales and providing a source of cheap protein and nutritious food, effectively providing a safety net that is preventing communities from falling deep into poverty. Where formal access to support has proven economically or institutionally restrictive, or individuals do not have access to land or other means of production, the ocean serves as a local commons resource. With that being said, poor rollout and shortcomings in verifying SSF cooperative members and the abolishment of subsistence status has meant that many of these fishers cannot legally access these resources. As previously stated, there is no subsistence license available, with people making do using recreational licenses. This in and of itself brings its own challenges, as the sales of recreational catch is not legal, meaning no formal market exists and people have sought to just sell within their communities. Moreover, the recreational license can only be purchased as a paper license from post offices, which frequently run out of the document and have been closing down across the province. The fee is considered extortionate by fishers, who are now being considered in the same breath as those who fish for sport and who struggle to survive on the same bag limits. Given these conditions and that few alternatives present, some of the respondents made mention of resorting to fishing without a license or exceeding daily catch limits to survive. And the final point on the slide, pertinent findings, further evidence of the forced criminalization of livelihoods is apparent in the way securitization has been used as a tool of neoliberal gentrification and exclusion in the blue economy. What do I mean by that? So a poignant example here is the detrimental impacts of conservation efforts on fishing communities, specifically the erection of MPAs that have been established without due consideration for the traditional communities that have historically relied on marine resources in the area. One community in particular has endured a number of human rights violations in the northern part of the province. When I say in particular, I mean in my research findings, not as the country as a whole. That is the Nabella fishing community, which resides on the shores of Lake St. Lucia, the majority of which has been established as an MPA under the isiMangaliso Wetland Park Authority. Policing of the MPA has resulted in several deaths of fishers from the community that were shot by rangers from the isiMangaliso, who claimed that they were suspected of poaching. Traveling further south down the Natal coast, you reach an area called Umdloti, which boasts an affluent residential community. Here, I encountered an example wherein private security companies were hired by residents to essentially annex the beach. Fisher folks spoken to reported that security guards physically and verbally harassed them while they are busy angling, and that signs stipulating that no fishing is allowed in the area were erected without endorsement from the municipality. Lastly, following the 9/11 attacks, The Durban harbour was closed off to the public in compliance with security conditions regulating access as stipulated by the US. These restrictions did not, however, extend to members of the local yacht club or restaurant goers along the harbour. This distinction and differential treatment is indicative of continued racial and class divides in the country and the systematic marginalization and discrimination experienced by fisher folk. Advocates for the fishers' rights have since been successful in regaining access to parts of the harbour for the local subsistence fishing community. Great, and on to the next slide. Cool. Contributions in formulating strategies and responses to blue crime. So, full disclosure, I am not a criminologist and was not certain of what I could add to this discussion. That being said, I've since identified several links learned from my research that could serve to contribute to the thinking on how we respond to the rise of blue crime. Crucially, what I have sought to demonstrate through these examples is that there's been a blurring of the lines between human rights and what constitutes criminal activity. So, that this warrants critical engagement with how it is we frame and conceptualize the illicit so as to prevent further marginalization of already disenfranchised communities. Specifically, I'd like to transpose my findings to 3 areas in developing responses to blue crime. The first response is tied to the example of poor policy implementation and governance. Here I posit that in efforts to address IUU and other illicit activities related to the blue economy, there is a need for the critical review of the policies and institutions informing industrial fisheries at an international as well as domestic level of engagement. So for this example, I focus here on the EU owing to the disconnect between the view of the region as a proponent for sustainable fishing and counterintuitive actions such as recent attempts by member states to exploit policy loopholes in how vessels document their catch. Here I argue for more effective global partnerships and robust domestic responses to managing distant water fishing fleets as a strategy in addressing IUU and protecting fish stocks. The next point, risks of jeopardizing local livelihoods. Yeah, so noting the experiences of South African fisherfolk, I want to draw attention to the potential impacts and risks associated with jeopardizing local livelihoods. Yeah, so forgoing social equity and ecological sustainable objectives in the blue economy in favor of prioritizing economic gains will serve to further marginalize already vulnerable coastal populations, eroding resilience and providing the facilitating conditions that may serve to force local communities to turn to alternate illicit activities to cope. So in some instances, systematic marginalization has served to radicalize communities, whereas increased vulnerability can render them more susceptible to exploitation by established criminal networks. In response, promoting co-management and equitable access is central to the sustainable use of marine sources and to ensure that the communities remain engaged.
Sorry, Nikita, 1 minute.
Great. So finally, I would like to reiterate the need to critically evaluate the manner in which we conceptualize the illicit and the potential dividends of reframing understandings through a prism of human rights. So from what I've described and researched for this presentation, it is appalling that we continue to allow and in some cases even subsidize destructive fishing practices while criminalizing the livelihoods of the local communities that Oh, did I get muted there? Well, I think, where was I last, Erica?
I think if you can just quickly wrap up the last point, that would be great.
Okay. So sorry, I think it got muted automatically when you mentioned 1 minute. So essentially, I want to reiterate the need to critically evaluate the manner in which we conceptualize the illicit and the potential dividends of reframing understandings through a prism of human rights. From what I've described and researched for this presentation, it's appalling that we continue to allow and in some cases even subsidize destructive fishery practices while criminalizing the livelihoods of local communities that rely on fisheries. Even the conflation of the illegal with unregulated and unreported proves problematic for the small scale and subsistence fisheries of the continent, as local practices are often informal or even precarious in nature. Caution needs to be exercised in how these narratives and conceptions are then used to legitimize the need to secure the blue economy, impose regulations, restrict access, and ultimately exclude communities by criminalizing the informal. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Nikita. I think, yeah, Danielle's paper set a very good foundation for the topic and for the discussion that will follow, indicating the landscape of illicit fishing in South Africa and also problems of regulatory frameworks. I think, Nikita, your research highlights the complexity of the matter and that we are kind of stuck between this position of more traditionally conceptualized organized crime and criminal activity, but also at the same time where these communities really depend on the products from the sea. And I hope that and you mentioned the reconceptualization of the illicit and illegal fishing towards the end. It is a complex matter. It's very complex. I think that being said, Nikita, you talked on a very on a local level and on a smaller scale. I hope that our third speaker, Isaac, will bring it back to a bigger discussion relating back to illicit fishing and the illicit blue economy on a larger scale and a larger organized crime scale. So without any further ado, Isaac, can you please unmute yourself and start your presentation? Thank you.
Okay, good morning. Do you hear me?
Have to do your introduction. Where am I? Let me quickly do that, please. I do apologize. Dr. Mbili Ngwema, Isaac Shavali, challenges of combating illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in Africa in the context of sustainable development goals. And then Isaac is a young Cameroonian researcher living in Yaoundé, Cameroon. He holds a PhD in political science, international relations from the International Relation Institute of Cameroon. Since 2014, he is specialized in the maritime field. His work focuses on the blue economy and the fight against IUU fishing. His master's dissertation and his doctoral thesis concern the adaptation of West and Central African states to international legal framework and the fight against IUU fishing. He is promoting the exercise of African states in their responsibilities as coastal states, flag states, port states, and market states on the one hand, and for the development of public-private partnerships in the fight against the threat to the continent. Thank you very much, Isaac. And as I said, I sense that your paper will really bring it back to a different region of Africa, but also to the broader scale. Please do share your presentation.
Okay. Good morning. Do you hear me, please?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I don't know what my video is not working. Don't know what. Okay, I will do. Okay, good morning, everyone. I am very happy this morning to share with you my communication. I don't know what happened with my video. Thank you for giving me the floor. Before starting my presentation, I want to thank the organizer of this conference for the opportunity that they give us to share ideas with others and with the world concerning the topic that is so important for us and for Africa. I cannot start without thanking Dr. Delika, who accepted our proposition in the step of call of proposal. Thank you very much, Doctor. I want to say to the other panelists that I'm really honored to be there with them, and I hope I hope we are beginning a long travel of collaboration. Allow me to clarify that I am French speaking is French. Allow me to clarify that French is my first language, so I am improving my English language speaking skills. Please forgive me in advance for any mistakes. My communication is entitled Challenges of Fighting Against Illegal Challenges of Combating UU Fishing in Africa in the Context of Sustainable Development Goals. UU fishing is considered as a global threat by international community. It's the reason why the fight against this phenomenon or crime is an indicator of Sustainable Development Goals 14, precisely as the Sustainable Development Goal 14.6, 14.7. If the fight against UU fishing is not new in the continent, it has taken an important signification with the aim of developing a sustainable blue economy in the continent. Moreover, the changing of world policy against UU fishing since 2001 with the adoption of international plans against UU fishing and the others legal instrument has clarified responsibilities of states and other actors in the fighting against UU fishing. In that global and continental context, actors have made efforts to combat UU fishing. Actors have made efforts to combat UU fishing at national, regional, continental, and international level. The evaluation of these efforts between 1990 and 2012 for the case of West and Central African states show that there are three major challenges in the fight against UU fishing in Africa in the context of sustainable development goals. Firstly, legal challenges. Secondly, cooperation challenges. Thirdly, public-private partnership challenges. This will be the 3 points of our presentation. Now, let us start with the third point, which concerns legal challenges. The legal challenges concern two main things. First, the domestication of legal instruments by all African states and the construction of a continental legal framework in the fight against UU fishing. Concerning the domestication of legal instruments by African states, I can say that since 2001, international legal instruments have been adopted, which clarify the responsibility of states in the fight against UU fishing as coastal state, as flag state, as port state, and as market state. We have there two categories of legal international instruments with the African state. The first category is composed by the international legal instrument adopted by the Universal International Organization, notably FAO and World Trade Organization. The second category of legal international instrument that interests African states in the fight against UU fishing is the legal instrument of European Union because of its impact for African states. The observation show that in the case of West and Central African states, some states has adapted their legislation, their fishery legislation to the international legal framework. In West Africa, we have, for example, Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea, which adopt a new fishery legislation in 2015. In Central Africa, we have Equatorial Guinea, which adopt new legislation. It is important that the other states, like my state, Cameroon, Congo, Gabon, adopt new fishery legislation. I want to precise that, for example, the case of Cameroon, the legislation is the legislation of 1994. For these three countries, the new legislation are necessary. So it is necessary for all African states to renew their fishery legislation. It is important to note that the implementation of international legal framework in the fight against UU fishing is an indicator for the Sustainable Development Goal 14. Some African states, like Cameroon, receive red card from European Union because of their, entre guillemets, defiance in their exercise of their responsibilities in the fight against UU fishing. Moreover, There are no many states which have ratified 4-state measure agreement and also World Trade Organization agreement on fisheries subsidies. At this date, I think we have no more than 3 countries for World Trade Organization agreement on fisheries subsidies, and we don't have more than 10 countries, African countries, concerning PSMR. At this why I suggest that African state has to ratify the international legal framework. The second point concerning legal challenges is the construction of a continental legal framework in the fight against UU fishing. Some science, I think since 2014, the fight against UU fishing has become a continental problem. In this way, some action or activity has been made by the African Union and in 2 directions. Firstly, the financement of activities of regional fishery regional organization, and also the reinforcement of capacity of national administrator. I think at the regional level, I think it's very important for African Union to work to have a continental legal instrument. Now I'm going to the second point, which concern the cooperation challenges. Concerning the cooperation challenges are in 3 levels. The first level is at the national level. At the national level, we have administration that are concerned by fighting UU fishing. For example, here in Central Africa, we have administration like fishery administration, military administration, transport administration, external relations administration, justice administration, and environment administration. So it is necessary to for all these administrations to reinforce their cooperation if we want to have good results in the fight against illegal fishing. It's important to note that in countries in Central Africa like Gabon or Cameroon, there are still existing cooperation between fishery ministry and military ministry concerning the fight against UU fishing. At the regional level, cooperation is existing in West and Central Africa, also Southern Africa. And for me, the problem now is to reinforce this cooperation, to intensify this cooperation. For example, in West Africa, we have what we call in French opération sous-régionale de surveillance de pêche, monitoring sub-regional operation. And this monitoring sub-regional operation face only one problem, the problem of financing. And I think that African states should work on it. At the international level, African states need to reinforce their cooperation with actors that are engaged in the fight against UU fishing, like European Union, United States of America, and also they want to reinforce their cooperation with the states that both are implicated in UU fishing activities in Africa. Now I'm going to my last point, my last challenge. The last challenge I will present is the development of public-private partnership in the fight against UU fishing in Africa. The third challenge is the challenge of the development of public-private partnership in the fight against UU fishing. One of the changes occurred against UU fishing is the implication of private actors, notably non-governmental organizations like Greenpeace, World Fund, Stop Illegal Fishing, Pew Charitable Trust, Environmental Justice Foundation. The study of public-private partnership in Africa gives us 2 results. First, the first result is that public-private partnership in the fight against illegal fishing exists in Africa. And we have two types of public-private partnership. Public-private partnership between state and private actor, and public-private partnership between private actors with regional fisheries organization. And the second result is that public-private partnership is positive for the fight against fishing in Africa. For example, in Gabon, the public-private partnership with sea shipper in the albacore operation give good result. For example, actually in Cameroon, the cooperation between the state and Environmental Justice Foundation is giving also good result. In SADC zone, the cooperation between Stop Illegal Fishing and state is also giving a good result. So the development of the public-private partnership at national, regional, and continental level will be good for the fight against illegal fishing in Africa. At the end, the fight against illegal fishing is still going on in Africa. In the context of sustainable development goals, there are three main challenges that we have present. The first is the legal challenges, precisely the domestication of international legal instruments by all African states, the ratification of post-state measure agreement and World Trade Organization agreement, the elaboration of continental legal instrument for the fight against illegal fishing in Africa. The second challenge is cooperation challenges at the national, regional, continental, and international level. And the third challenge is the development of public-private partnerships in the fight against illegal fishing to fight against illegal fishing in the continent. Thank you very much for your attention, and sincerely, I am sorry. I don't know what happened with my video. I am very sorry for that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Isaac. Not a problem at all. Thank you for that overview of and insight into the legal challenges facing illegal fishing on the African continent. Yeah, thank you for your insight there. I hope it's something that we can actually explore in the question and answer session now. Participants, we have a good 20 minutes for questions. I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Please either post your questions in the chat area in the Q&A. Let me see. I have no questions at the moment, or you can raise your hand if you would like to ask a question as well. I'm going to give about 10-20 seconds or so to see if we can have any questions. Otherwise, I will proceed to a few questions that I have for each of the speakers. If you can, for the presenters, Isaac, I know you're facing a little bit of challenges, but for the other two speakers, Nikita and Danielle, if you can please make your video visible while we have the Q&A, that would be great. Okay, I don't see any questions. Okay, no questions yet. I will then proceed to ask, please, if questions should come up, please post them in the Q&A. I will then proceed to ask questions to each of our presenters, and I think let's take it on that. Danielle, you first, Nikita, and then Isaac, but please do raise your hand if you would like to respond to some of the questions. Danielle, I will start with you. You used the concept of unjust MPAs, and I think that's a very strong term to use. You do justify why you use unjust MPAs, but I was wondering if you can provide any recommendations on how we can address the problem of unjust MPAs, maybe a little bit more speaking towards the policy side of things. So that's the first question. The second question, and that spills over into Nikita, what you've said, both of you mentioned high levels of corruption. And it seems like, you know, we can talk about organized crime on a local level, but it seems like there is still this very high prevalence in South Africa of corruption within the fishing industry. If you can just shed some light, if you use the concept of high levels of corruption, what it is that you're referring to. Nikita, I assume maybe in your case, it would refer to ports, port control, containers, etc. obtaining licenses, maybe Danielle, in both the cases, bribing corrupt police officers, etc. So if you can just shed some light. So Danielle, maybe you can end with that. Nikita, you can pick it up, just conceptualizing and also contextualizing corruption within the industry. And then Isaac, with regards to that, I was wondering if you can maybe share a little bit more context with regards to unregulated fishing within your research area. What is it that we're actually talking about? Is it what is the range? So just color in the picture for us a little bit more, so that those of us not familiar with your research and your topic, just share with us. If you talk about the legal challenges, what is it that these legal challenges are really addressing? I assume that we're talking about numerous actors, that are role players involved in this giant illicit industry. So maybe a little bit of contextualization. Again, if you can keep it short and to the point, that would be great, and then we can keep we can each give an answer. Danielle, please go ahead.
Okay, so with the concepts of unjust MPAs, the reason I used that term is because I think that was the term that has been used in some of the literature surrounding perceptions of MPAs from coastal communities in particular. So yeah, it's really just relating to people who feel that the regulations in place are unfair because it excludes them from fishing, from getting food, from their livelihoods, and from places of historical significance for them. And yeah, I think really what I've seen, what a lot of people recommend to maybe help with these perceptions is just to have a more robust and just a really much more inclusive form of stakeholder engagement. So often what's done with stakeholder engagement when it comes to the implementation of MPAs is that they will have stakeholders from communities, but it's for people, like these are the fishermen, or this is the leader of this community or something, but it doesn't necessarily take into account that a lot of people are involved within the community, within the MPA. So there isn't necessarily an excellent representation of communities often in stakeholder engagement, if you know what I mean. And I think if people have a chance to talk, to express their needs for the MPAs and also to be listened to, I think that will definitely help with those feelings of unfairness. And also really just education and awareness raising. Something that has come up is that a lot of people don't necessarily know why the MPA even exists. They think it's because it's going to help with tourists. Tourists can come fish. They see people, recreational fishers coming and just having a fun time in the MPA, and they're not allowed to go do that. So there's really just an imbalance. Like a lot of people don't really know why that MPA even exists. And so perhaps with education surrounding sustainability and the need to preserve some species, perhaps that will help people. But yeah, it's definitely a very long and complicated process because, like I emphasized, there is historical injustices and all of that. And then in relation to corruption, I was definitely going to say that bribery is definitely one of the things that affects the implementation of MPAs effectively. And I think also people might bribe for fishing licenses, or otherwise people who want to fish, who are not even necessarily part of the coastal community or whatever. Because people do want to fish in the MPAs. People like to fish. So they may bribe police officers or whoever is there to be able to do that. And then also, I didn't really go into this much, but you do hear that there are policemen and there are even politicians involved within, the bigger syndicates. Obviously no naming names, but we do know that corruption is a very big issue in South Africa. And then when you have it related to the gangs as well, who are also involved in the poaching, it's really a whole big network of people whose actions will really counter the objectives of MPAs. Perhaps Nikita can elaborate.
Yeah, just thanks for that, Danielle. Just maybe for some of our attendees who called in a little bit late, MPAs refers to marine protected areas.
Yes.
Yeah, no. Okay, Nikita, if you can quickly share your insight with regards to corruption, both local level and also high level, Isaac context, and then we do have one question from attendees as well.
Yeah, so similar to Danielle, I don't really grapple much with corruption, save I think I mentioned it in one of my first slides. I mentioned weak institutions and corruption as kind of abetting and allowing for illicit blue crime to spread. I did in kind of with the like background reading that I was doing in preparation for this, something that could serve as an example here is I think in corruption at a higher state level with fishing, there's evidence of, you know, officials like state officials and government officials in South Africa signing off on catch quotas that are like the biomass exceeds what should be permitted. In some areas it exceeds like what we've counted for shark populations, for example, but then we sign off on exports for shark fins, for example. So there's levels of corruption layered there. I think at the kind of local level where I've been focusing on the more like grassroots level, what I could draw attention to here is kind of like how the poor policy design has essentially created spaces for corruption. So with the example of licenses and subsistence fishers having to make do with recreational licenses, that's a like kind of a facilitating environment for corruption to leak in at the level where, you know, if we can't access if a post office is closed, they don't have or are not renewing the number of documents to get a license, I have no choice but to fish without one. Police comes along, you know, this is illegal what I'm doing because technically I do not have a license, even though it was not accessible to me. That's not going to fly. You palm, like it's called palming. You just palm off the police officer and you carry on along your way. So we're kind of like building in through these like ineffective policies and kind of legal mechanisms. We're building in spaces for corruption, both at a local and a higher institutional level.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that, Nikita. Isaac, if you can then take 2 minutes or so to just share us, just give us a little bit of contextualization with regards to illegal fishing in your research.
Okay, thank you very much for the floor again. Concerning the context of illegal fishing in my research, since 2014, I start working in fight against illegal fishing in the two areas. The first area is Central Africa, and the second area is West Africa. And in that way, I see some difference between the two areas. The first area, the West Central Africa, the West Africa area, we have states that have fishery legislation and operational structure that were not like the fishery legislation and the operational structure of Central African state. And now we make research, and we saw that it's very important for state to review their fishery legislation if they want to fight efficaciously, if they want to fight illegal fishing. And not only renew, but states have to be able to applicate, if I can say that in French, excuse me, if they have to be able to applicate the legislation. That is globally the context of my research. What I can say is that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Isaac. We do have a question from one of our attendees, Professor Filia Alum. Filia, can I allow you to talk? Just check if it works, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much again for a brilliant panel. It's so refreshing to hear On the one hand, research from which is not close to mine, but also all these details and this kind of different approaches that you are all using. So I suppose I have two questions. One is, I suppose, the one linked to corruption, where you've all made the point about how context is really, really important. And I just want to perhaps think about, and some of you have mentioned it, I suppose, but I just want to hear a bit more around the role of the state, I suppose, and what the state is or not doing. You've talked about facilitating and allowing spaces for corruption to take place. And I just wonder how we can talk about the state in relation to this, not looking after, if you want, the natural environment. And I suppose the second question, I heard one of you, I think, mention it vaguely, but also from my own personal interest is what about when you do this research, is there a gender perspective? Is this a male activity, or is there no gender segregation? So I wonder whether you could speak to these two specific aspects or, in relation to your research. And again, thank you, Derika, for a fantastic panel.
Pleasure, Philia. Thank you for the questions. I'm going to throw the gender one. We have 10 minutes, a little bit 9 minutes left. I'm going to throw the gender one to you, Nikita, just because I think you've actually done the primary data research on the ground. So I think you will be able to provide more insight. And then I'm going to do the state-centric approach that Philia mentioned, or let's call it the state approach. I'm going to throw that quickly to Danielle and Isaac. If we can keep our comments, unfortunately, to 2 minutes or so. But I will interrupt you. So please, Nikita, yeah, I'm sorry that I'm throwing you on the bus a little bit here, but I think you do have something to say about the gender one.
No, happy to talk about it. Thank you so much for your question, Prof. Alam. Yeah, so again, I think, what's useful about focusing on and like really zeroing in these local contexts is that you can quite readily transpose them to international contexts, and they share quite a lot of detail. And, when you're talking to a woman about her lived experiences, these kind of gendered perspectives that you talk about and, falls by the wayside in literature and policy, it becomes a lot more potent. So I think maybe what's useful here is I will share an example of one of the research findings I had, and also kind of try to locate this in the kind of exacerbated vulnerabilities that we have in the fishery sector at a small scale and subsistence level. So what I mean by that is, as I've kind of shared with my examples, it's clear that it's precarious in nature. The small-scale fishery sector in South Africa and continental-wide is incredibly precarious in nature. I think small-scale and subsistence fisheries accounts for about 2/3 or 70% of South African fisheries, and yet it's becoming increasingly invisible. And there's almost like systematic erasure of this incredibly important sector at a local level within policy frameworks. So, children certainly are even more so marginalized in these already ineffectual policies, and by nature are made even more so invisible and even more so vulnerable. So what I'll kind of give here 2 examples of how there's evidence of on the ground gendered, and I'll bring in youth as well, impacts. The fact that rights and kind of rights aren't protected for small scale and subsistence fisher folk. The fact that in some instances, like subsistence isn't recognized, as well as rights aren't actively protected, and the state isn't being held accountable. What that means is, just on the ground, if we don't recognize subsistence folk, they don't have designated areas for fishing. So if your daily is going to work, you need to use the toilet. There's no toilets available or sanitation facilities. Man, pop off into the bush. Woman, what does she do? The fact that, because these people have been forcibly criminalized, their livelihoods have been forcibly criminalized, forces a lot of fishers to fish at night. So specifically in the MPA areas, they're considered poachers. They have to go at night. Women don't readily as often, because there's a lot more of a kind of physical risk to being, exposed to being on the beach by yourself at night, or with some of the lake areas, hippos, wild animals. It's the heightened danger of activities at night. what I've also seen is of coping strategies. What are the alternative livelihoods that people shift towards in trying to cope with these stresses on their preferred livelihood, which is fishing? Women, and this is the case a bit more on the continent as well, there's evidence of women turning to sex work to try to look for alternative livelihoods and income. Yes, I think there are loads of very detailed kind of gendered examples that come through in the on-the-ground research, which are broadly alluded to in the literature. But there's, I think, the key way to act on it is by like at a more holistic level, trying to enshrine these kind of social equity and, you know, recognize these subsistence and small-scale fishery rights in policy and legislation so that we can start to act on these differential gendered impacts.
Okay, thanks, Nikita. We have 4 minutes left. Unfortunately, Philia, we're not going to be able to really unpack that state question that you had. Danielle, I'm going to give this to Isaac quickly for a minute, and then I'm going to give it to you for a minute, and then I'm going to say thank you to everyone. Isaac, any response on Philia's question?
Thank you very much for the word again. Concerning the corruption, problem of corruption is also very important here in Central Africa. Sometimes the actors of Eurofishing corrupt the administrator, and it's a very big problem because when corruption is there, it's very difficult to I will call it applicate entre guillemets to applicate the legislation. Whenever even if the boards are raisonné, but sometimes we see no effect because of corruption. I think it's a very big problem.
Perfect, thank you, Isaac. And then Danielle, you're going to wrap it up. Any insights from your side?
Yeah, the first thing that came to my mind with regards to the state-led management and also corruption is just in terms of South Africa, there is a lot of focus on, I mean, a lot of the people in charge have connections with, let's say, very extractive industries. So we see, just for example, recently there was a whole lawsuit because I think it was Shell wanted to conduct gas exploration surveys in the Wild Coast and also the West Coast. And the South African government was going to allow this despite having little to no consultation with communities, or basically everyone thought it was a bad idea, essentially, except for the government. And even though South Africa does put a lot of focus on sustainability in the way that they talk, in the way that it's implemented, it's just really not seen. So you really just have to wonder when you see decisions like that being made, who is benefiting, you know? They say, oh, it's going to promote economic growth, but at what cost, you know? So that's the one thing that really came to my mind. But yeah, I can't really speak much longer about that.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to conclude the panel. First of all, I'm going to say thank you to the organizers of the conference for giving us the platform to discuss this topic. I know it's a big, broad operation. The members from the Secretariat, Shanique, you've been wonderful. WhatsApps, it's been absolutely fantastic coordinating everything. I don't know how you do it, but thank you for that. To the speakers, Nikita, Danielle, and Isaac, thank you for agreeing to share your research. Thank you for agreeing to share this platform. It's been amazing. Thank you for keeping to the time. Thank you for keeping your answers informative but short, so that we can actually have a discussion. I hope we stay in touch. I hope we keep on talking about this topic. And then
thank you as well.
Yeah, thanks, Philia. Last but not least, I want to thank the people attending the panel. Thank you for listening. It's so great. We had a small crowd, but we had a crowd. And thank you, Philia, for the questions. Colleagues, I hope we stay in touch. This is not the end. This is the end of the panel, but it's not the end of our discussion. Please attend some of the other panels now. The conference is still running for a few more hours. Yeah, I think the last panel starts at 2 o'clock South African time. So please go onto the website, have a look at some of the other panels, and hopefully I'll see you in a room soon. Yeah. Thanks, colleagues. We'll speak again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.